I'm Ray Andrews, a former Australian serviceman and a friend of the Shrine of Remembrance in St Kilda Road in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. The shrine was founded in 1934 as the National War Memorial of Victoria. The shrine exists to engage all Victorians in remembering, valuing and commemorating both service and sacrifice. Today, at the end of July 2021, I'm seated in the western precinct of our awe-inspiring shrine called the Visitors Centre. In my company are four very remarkable men. Colonel George Mackenzie, OBE, RFD, Lieutenant Colonel David Ford, CVO, AM, GM, Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Lombardo, and Mr Peter Whitelaw. All four of these men were appointed as trustees of the shrine for life. George in 1978, David in 1982, Adrian in 1987, and Peter in 1995. Later they were appointed governors of the shrine for life, hence their title of Life Governors. These men with me today are the last four living from a total of 31 trustees appointed since 1933. Together, they've provided 142 years of continuous service to the shrine and thereby to us all. The service of the Shrine Life Governors is voluntary. Their only reward, apart from the honour of being appointed and of serving Victoria, is that the shrine flags will be lowered to half-mast at the time of their death. Today, I'll be interviewing George, David, Adrian and Peter on their military experience, the significant events that occurred during their terms as trustees, and since 2001, major shrine developments and events during their time as life governors. Lastly, I'll ask about the future, the men's views of what the next several decades might look like as far as the shrine is concerned. George, as the most senior life governor present, can we start with you? Please tell us about your military background and experiences.
I was a self-employed solicitor in 1962 when I joined the Citizen Military Forces. I was also elected to the City of Kew Council, and I was fairly busy at the time. I became the Mayor of Kew in 1966, but despite that I kept up my Army Reserve requirements, attending parades and weekend bivouacs and the like. In 1970, I was asked by the Minister for the Army, who happened to be a personal friend, if I would be willing to go to Vietnam to take over the role of Deputy Assistant Director of Legal Services for the Australian forces in Vietnam, relieving an officer who was on his second tour of duty and who was extremely tired. I spoke to my partners in my legal practice and to my family, and with some reluctance they agreed to allow me to go. So in November 1970, I hopped on the Big White Bird and went to Vietnam. My duties in Vietnam as the senior legal officer in that country for the Australian forces was to supervise the administration of discipline, pay compensation to South Vietnamese if they suffered loss or damage as a result of Australian military activity, unless that activity was in pursuit of the war, and to see that we observed the Geneva Conventions with respect to any prisoners of war we had. I had two other lawyers in Vietnam with me, one at Nui Dat and one at Vung Tau, and I would travel to see each of them once a week. Life was reasonably quiet until Christmas Day 1970, when a soldier under the influence shot and killed 2 sergeants and seriously injured a third. And the following day, an officer was charged with striking a soldier with a pistol. And the following day, a warrant officer, on his first day in Vietnam, was doing a tour of Nui Dat in his Land Rover with 2 other warrant officers. They'd visited the sergeant's messes, and he crashed the Land Rover and seriously injured himself and his passengers. So I suddenly found myself with a plethora of courts-martial lined up. One of the consequences of this was the arrival in Vietnam of another 10 military lawyers. The Director of Legal Services, who was well known for looking after the legal corps, made sure every lawyer he could lay his hands on got a Guernsey. So the country was alive with lawyers, including a Supreme Court judge and a couple of QCs from Sydney. The courts-martial themselves were a bit of a problem because they had to be conducted at Vung Tau. The officers who arrived from Australia to constitute the court included a brigadier who's known to my fellow life governors. He found himself in an area commanded by a colonel. The colonel didn't like the brigadier's presence. The brigadier insisted upon life as it would be in Canberra, which was a bit difficult in a sandy climate. The courts-martial went off. I participated in a number of them. Finally, at the end of May of 1971, I returned to Australia, and I was suddenly very popular with ex-service organisations because I was a 40-year-old who'd seen service and I was a bit active. So I found myself invited to join the RSL as a state executive member, as a trustee of the RSL. I was invited to join the Australian Legion of Ex-Servicemen and Women. I was made a member of the Services Canteen Trust Fund and a member of the Patriotic Funds Council of Victoria, which is now the Victorian Veterans Council. So I was fairly involved in ex-service activities. In 1978, one of the members of the Patriotic Funds Council, Colonel Edna Doig, who was a trustee of the Shrine, nominated me to become a trustee. And so I became a trustee in December 1978. I think I was the first trustee who had not had service in World War I or II. So I was a bit of a junior, and as such I think I was expected to take a reasonable share of the load when it came to attendance at pilgrimages and services. And I was relieved when my colleague David Ford was appointed a trustee because we could now share the burden.
Thank you very much, George. A good segue into your military background and experiences, David.
Well, I was a career soldier. I went straight from school to the Royal Military College, Duntroon, did the 4-year course there, and somehow managed to graduate. I was a logistician rather than a warrior, although I don't always describe myself that way. When we're out meeting people and someone comes along and says, well, what do you do for a living? If I don't like the people particularly, I'm not attracted to them, I usually just say I was a public servant. That's a dead killer immediately, and they move on to someone else. If it's someone who looks quite interesting, I say I was a trained killer. That tends to get their attention, but there we go. But I was a logistician, which meant I was with the corps that looked after transport and feeding and ammunition and that sort of stuff. So the first appointment was with a transport unit. I was then attached to the British Army and served with a unit there in Kuala Lumpur and in Malacca. Having come back from there, I ended up being sent to the officer training unit, where my two fellow colleagues who are here today are graduates there. I won't say I don't know how they made it, because they did very well indeed. And that was one of my better postings. But what followed on from there was time in Vietnam as the officer on the headquarters. I was responsible for the ammunition and feeding, and the most important thing which I found was the mail service. If the mail didn't get through, I had an uncomfortable night with people having a go at me. Luckily that didn't happen terribly often. So I then came back from there as an instructor at the Corps School, and then did Staff College down at Queenscliff. After that, I ended up going to a staff job, and I suddenly found that after having been at two of my best appointments, which was the officer training unit and of course the active service in Vietnam, I found that peacetime soldiering wasn't all that it was cut out to be. And I decided there must be something else to do. And I happened to look in the Age one Saturday morning, and saw this job of Chief of Protocol advertised. And I thought, I can do all of that when I read the description. So I did become the Chief of Protocol for the next 20 years. And you may be saying, well, what on earth does a Chief of Protocol do? Well, it was a state government appointment in the Premier's department, and it looked after Premier's hospitality, looked after official visitors to the state, it looked after honours and awards, and it looked after ceremonial things. So that was followed on fairly easily from my military background. And I served 6 premiers, 3 from each side, so quite obviously I was no political challenge to any of them. During that time with the visitors, I was very lucky in having the visitors we did were the royal family, heads of state, heads of government. We had the Pope, had a United States President and Vice President, so they were quite enjoyable times. It was a great time. Then I was invited to become a trustee in 1982, and that, of course, is where it all started. In addition to that, I was president of Melbourne Legacy. I was on the Vietnam Veterans Council, on the Veterans Council. I was also the Victorian representative on the Order of Australia Council and the Bravery Council. Did that for 10 years. So that was my background.
Thank you, David. Adrian, over to you, your military background and experience, please.
Unlike David, I was a migrant kid that arrived in Australia at age 10. And the last thing I ever wanted to do was to join the army. And I think Mr. Menzies decided that I should. And I was conscripted in the first intake of national service in June of 1965. And I vividly recall the effort over the next couple of weeks of interviews and psychology tests and all these other things that I'd never come across before, which led to selection as an officer cadet. And some 2 weeks after I marched into Puckapunyal, I took my first flight ever from Mangalore to Richmond, and then bus to Skyville. which was a real eye-opener for me. But I really decided that I wanted to make the best of it, and just had no intention of serving more than the 2 years. However, after a short while, I expressed some interest in languages, and I was invited to attend a selection course at the RAF School of Languages, where I particularly wanted to do Japanese, but when tested, the staff suggested that my hearing wasn't all that great and hasn't got any better since, and they recommended I do Indonesian, which I did, and I passed with distinction on that course. And as a result of that, I was posted to Malaysia, to the 8th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment as a platoon commander, but I was fortunate to also have a sideline because I could speak Indonesian, which is very similar to Malay, in terms of conducting and organising the battalion's civil aid to the civil power, if you like, or current affairs, civil affairs at least, where we actually looked after a Malaysian village and provided medical, dental support, engineering support, all those sort of things. So I found that extremely interesting, and because I was actually in meetings with the most senior people in Malacca at the time. At the same time, I trained with my platoon as a platoon commander, and in 1969 returned for training for Vietnam, and by November 69 we took off. Quite interesting. The instruction was you must not wear uniform on the way to Vietnam, because we're going by civilian aircraft. So we all, strangely, all had army trousers, but we all had to wear a funny shirt. So you can imagine the Hawaiian shirts and the like. Anyway, we arrived in Vietnam, and in fact, on my first night in country, the battalion which we were taking over from, 9RAR, had a pretty major incident, and unfortunately George wasn't there because he came the next year, but one of the 9RAR platoon commanders was killed by one of the soldiers by what was called a fragging, or a grenade. So that was the introduction. And I suddenly thought, gee, platoon commanding might not be such a great deal. Yeah. But anyway, we started our duty, and we spent generally, as infantry platoon commanders, we generally spent a month at a time in the country and on patrol and ambushing. And unfortunately, 3 months after my beginning of the tour, I was wounded, so I had to be repatriated. Following that, however, I managed to do some interesting postings. I was asked to be the lecturer in charge of Indonesian, where I'd learnt a few years before, which I did for 3 years. And then I became the officer in command of one of the 6th Battalion's rifle companies, which I enjoyed tremendously. And then was selected for Staff College in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia as the sole Australian student. Following which we came back, and we at least had some staff posting just across the road from the shrine. And it was interesting how at that stage that was the first time really I'd been to visit the shrine, when I was posted across the road here. And I got involved quite heavily in computing, which I did for a number of years, and that led me to posting to the US, where I undertook quite a number of computing and management training modules with the US Army. Then came back on promotion and finished off here in 1987. So that was my military service. In terms of the shrine, I was invited by these two gentlemen on the right, George and David, to consider becoming a trustee, and I was then interviewed by Peter Isaacson, who was the chairman, and Bill Littlejohn, the vice chairman, and was then appointed in September 1987 as the trustee. So that's my sort of brief story.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you. Peter, yours, please. Your military experience, your military background.
Thank you, Ray. I was a young green 20-year-old in 1966 when my marble was drawn out of the barrel as far as the National Service call-up was concerned. I had the option of deferring because I was doing electronics engineering at RMIT at the time, but I decided, in view of the delays to my career, that I'd probably be better getting over my National Service over and done with. So I complied, and a few weeks later was marching into South Melbourne to join the Army. Along with several hundred others, I was bussed up to Puckapunyal, cold as it was, in the middle of June in 1966. And given my roles, I was introduced immediately to haircuts. I'd already had a short haircut, but I had two in the same week on arrival. A number of vaccinations, which is fairly topical today, and some pretty stringent lessons in marching, weapon control, fitness, and all of those sort of things. But most of my first 2 weeks were in fact sitting in the kitchen peeling potatoes and carrots. And I figured if this is going to be my army career for the rest of my life, I better do something different. And I heard about the option of applying for officer training at OTU Skyville, which I did, and I was fortunate to pass the selection criteria. Flew, like Adrian, from Mangalore up to Richmond and bussed into Skyville, which was the sort of premier officer training unit of the era. Had the sudden realisation as this bald-headed Warrant Officer Class 1 stuck his head in the bus and yelled with all his might and told us to get off the bus. And from there on, we were quick marching everywhere. Skyville was probably a seminal experience in my life. It probably changed my direction forever. It was tough. We did significant military exercises. We were on an education program with courses up until 9 o'clock at night, field exercises with helicopters, weapons and whatever else. But fortunately I managed to scrape through and graduated from Skyville in December 1966. My then girlfriend and now my wife pinned my pips on my uniform at that graduation ceremony. I was also very pleased to find out that I wasn't going to be posted to Vietnam as a platoon commander, and because of my electronics background, I was selected to move into a role within Army headquarters, and this was a section of Army headquarters based at Albert Park Barracks, just down the road here. And I marched in there in early January 1967 to meet my staff, who consisted of 3 Warrant Officer Class 2, who looked at this green 20-year-old second lieutenant and realised that they were supposed to salute me, which they did, but not very often. My assignment was to look after the electronics maintenance aspects of a number of systems, particularly what was then a top secret project called the Rapier Missile Project. And as a consequence, I spent the remaining 18 months of my national service in a pretty cushy job, working in Albert Park, living at home, and being able to having a pretty free life. Lots of my friends and relatives said, "What are you doing in the Army?" because it was rather unusual. And of course, all I could answer was that I was in administration. So I served out my 2 years. When I left the Army, I was able to finish my electronics diploma. I was able to join with 2 or 3 major multinational electronics technology companies and enjoyed a career of what was initially as an engineer and later as a sales and marketing person, because that's where there was more money. Through most of those years. In 1985, I caught up with some of my OTU Skyville classmates, and we decided we should form an association, and I was one of the founders of that organisation. We've gone on and now have something in excess of 600 members across Australia, and our major activity, apart from patting ourselves on the back and saying how good we were, has been to sponsor youth leadership programs, particularly at Lord and Lady Summers camps over all those years. In 1995, I had caught up with Adrian here, and I was nominated to come and join the Shrine as a trustee. I fortunately knew David Ford as well, and Bruce Ruxton, who was an old mate, a neighbour of ours in Beaumaris, who had convinced me to join the Beaumaris RSL, supported my application. So that's how I came to join the trust at that time. Since then I've had a number of projects. Thanks to George, I was nominated to become the chair of the Gallipoli Oaks project, which was run by the National Trust in Victoria. And through that, in the centenary of Anzac, we managed to propagate some 600 Gallipoli oak trees, which were planted in the gardens of schools throughout Victoria. A little later, I joined the Wood End RSL, took on a major project there of creating a wall of remembrance at the Avenue of Honour in Wood End, which was a great success to commemorate those from the district who had served in World War I, one of whom was my grandfather. I later became the president of Wood End RSL, and for my sins, I was just recently awarded RSL Life membership. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I thank the four of you for sharing your military background and your experience with us. It's been most interesting.